Hello, class. Today's lesson is on Kantian duty ethics. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. First, a little bit of background. You'll remember we've been learning about the distinction between two ways of thinking about morality: consequentialism, according to which the right thing to do is the thing that has the best consequences, and deontology, according to which the right thing to do is follow the rules. That is, according to which morality is a matter of rights and obligations. This lesson has to do with deontology. So for Kant, he's a duty ethicist. He thinks morality is a matter of duties or obligations. So for example, you have a right to life, and I have an obligation not to kill you. You have a right to property, and I have an obligation not to steal your stuff. That is, stealing and killing are against the rules. That's the way the duty ethicist or the deontologist thinks about ethics. So this is the ethics of obligation as opposed to utilitarian ethics or consequentialist moral reasoning. This lesson's on something called the categorical imperative, which you'll understand by the end of the lesson. The relevant reading is from Immanuel Kant's Groundwork on the Metaphysics of Morals. Immanuel Kant, a towering figure in modern philosophy, 18th century Prussian or German philosopher, highly influential, made enduring contributions to almost every area of philosophy, including the one we're learning about today, ethics. It's always kind of a challenge to know where to start with Kantian duty ethics. There's kind of a lot of background information that you need to know to understand his perspective, but I find it's helpful to start with this. For Kant, a human being is a moral agent. That is, a human being is a moral being, a member of the moral community. And what made human beings moral agents or moral beings, or what makes human beings moral agents or moral beings, is that we are rational, that is, we have minds that can understand the moral law, and we are autonomous, that is, we have a free will, so we can choose whether or not we obey the moral law. And it's our rationality and our autonomy that make us moral beings or moral agents. That is, our rationality and autonomy is what gives us membership in the moral community. It's the source of our rights and obligations. This, I think, is the key idea. If you understand this idea, most of the rest of what you need to know about Kant can be related back to it. This is also, I would say, the kind of thing that you probably already know. I think it was Friedrich Nietzsche who said that Kant's moral philosophy is a defense of common sense morality or the ordinary man's morality in terms that the ordinary man couldn't possibly understand. And so I think there's kind of something to this. So I'm often struck when I teach students Kantian duty ethics that it's the sort of thing that if you were raised properly, you sort of already know. So let me give you some examples of this. So your being a moral agent or a member of the moral community requires you to be rational and autonomous. So consider this example. A child, small child, say first grade or second grade or something like that, finds his daddy's gun, puts it in his book bag, brings it to school, and shoots somebody. Is the child responsible? Is it his fault? You might think, well, no, not really. He's just a kid. He didn't know any better. The responsibility lies with his father, who didn't store his guns properly. Because he's the adult who should have known better. That is, the kid didn't really know any better. He wasn't fully rational. He wasn't capable of understanding his behavior, the consequences of his actions, what was right and what was wrong. So we do have this sense that morality requires rationality. Or consider how foolish it would be to put a crocodile on trial for killing somebody. Crocodiles don't understand that killing is wrong, they just act on instinct. And so we do tend to think that morality requires rationality. Indeed, this is why this kind of assumption is even built into criminal justice. So this is why we treat juveniles differently than adults in criminal law. That is, the goal of juvenile justice is to rehabilitate or educate, Whereas the goal of adult justice is to hold responsible. See, so we don't hold you responsible until you're a fully rational adult. This is also why young people or children are unable to consent to sexual relationships, because their minds aren't developed enough to understand what it is they're consenting to. And so we do have this sense that your rights and your obligations and your freedoms all are dependent on a certain degree of rationality. Okay, so that's the rational piece. This is also true of autonomy. That is, there's an old idea in philosophy that ought implies can. If I tell you you should do something, it's implied that you could do it. It wouldn't make sense for me to tell you to do something that's not within your power. So it makes sense for a doctor to tell you should lose weight or you should gain weight, because losing and gaining weight is at least somewhat in your control. But it wouldn't make much sense for a doctor to tell you should lose or gain height, because you can't control how tall you are. And so if I tell you should do something, it's implied that you could do something. And so there's this idea that moral responsibility requires free will. So again, give you an example. Imagine I'm, driving down the street and somebody's dog runs out in front of my car, and I see it, and I slam on the brakes, and unfortunately, it all happened so fast, and I didn't have enough time or distance to stop, and I run over and kill the poor dog on accident. And I stop, and I try to find the owner, and so on and so forth. Now, that's a horrible tragedy, but it's just an accident, not really my fault. But now, contrast that with this. Suppose I'm driving down the road and I see a dog playing in the yard, and I think, oh, that's stupid mud. I always hated that dog anyway. And I turn the wheel and push the accelerator and deliberately run over the dog and drive off laughing into the sunset. Now, is there a moral difference between my running over the dog on accident and my running over the dog on purpose? And you probably will see quite clearly that, yes, there's a moral difference, that running over the dog on purpose was much worse. Now, I might ask, well, what difference does it make? Either way, the dog is dead. But it does make a difference, because the first case I did it on accident, not on purpose. I didn't intend to kill the dog. It was just an accident. Whereas the second case, I did it on purpose, willingly, intentionally, and that makes a serious moral difference. That is, regardless of the consequences, even if the consequences are the same, the contents of my mind made a difference. Whether or not I intended to cause the harm made a difference in the moral quality of the harm. Okay, so you can see, and we make this distinction in law as well. There's a difference between involuntary manslaughter and murder. Now, involuntary manslaughter might be a very bad thing. You might be guilty of negligence, but it's not as bad as murder, because murder involved intent, and your intending to do harm makes the crime worse. And we all understand this. And so you can see how our moral responsibility and our rights and our freedoms are all sort of contingent on our rationality and autonomy. And so this is a key idea for Kant, is that our membership in the moral community depends on our mind and our will. Okay. Hold that idea in your head as we go. I'll refer back to it repeatedly. It will help you understand. Okay, now, Kant has a thought experiment. He encourages us to think about two shopkeepers who have both decided not to cheat their customers. But their reason for not cheating their customers is different. So the first shopkeeper decides not to cheat his customers for fear of negative consequences. That is, he doesn't cheat his customers because he thinks he will get caught. He thinks he will get in trouble. He thinks it will be bad for his reputation, which will be bad for his business. And so in order to avoid harm to his reputation, in order to avoid harm to his business, he refrains from cheating his customers. That's the first shopkeeper. Now consider the second shopkeeper. The second shopkeeper, says Kant, also decides not to cheat his customers, but his reason for not cheating his customers is different. He decides not to cheat his customers out of a belief that he has a moral obligation not to cheat his customers. That is, he thinks that cheating his customers would be morally wrong. It would be a violation of the moral law, regardless of whether or not it's bad for business. Now, is there a moral difference between the two shopkeepers? Kant says that there is. He says that only the second shopkeeper has a good will. That is, both shopkeepers have, if you will, done the right thing, but only the second shopkeeper has done the right thing for the right reasons. That is, the second shopkeeper had good intentions. Many of you will agree with that, and if you agree with that, you're already thinking like a Kantian. Because if you think about it, from a consequentialist perspective, there really is no moral difference between the two shopkeepers. Their behavior is the same, and the consequences of their behavior are the same. Neither one of them has done any harm. Both of them have, in a way, followed the rules. But Kant says that the difference in intention makes a significant moral difference. That is, to have what he calls a good will, it's not enough just to do the right thing. You have to do the right thing for the right reasons. And so this is an illustration of a distinction that Kant makes between what he calls a hypothetical imperative and a categorical imperative. So an imperative is just something that you should do. Like, it's imperative that you study if you want to pass your classes. A hypothetical imperative is something you should do provided that some hypothetical condition is met. So, the example I gave you is an example of a hypothetical imperative. If you want to pass your classes, then you should study. So here, whether or not you should study, whether or not it's imperative that you study, is contingent on the hypothetical condition that you want to pass. It's contingent on something you desire. Should you study? Well, it depends on whether or not you want to pass. And notice now, this first shopkeeper, he was obeying a hypothetical imperative. So whether or not he cheated his customers was contingent on the hypothetical condition that it would be bad for business. So if it would be bad for business, if he would get in trouble, then he should not cheat his customers. And he believed that it would, so he didn't. But suppose it would be good for business. Suppose he could get away with it. Suppose the hypothetical condition is not met. In that case, it seems he would believe himself free to cheat his customers. You see, and so the hypothetical imperatives, they have this kind of contingent formulation. That is, whether or not you should do something on a hypothetical imperative always depends. It's sort of like, should I cheat my customers? Well, it depends. Would it be bad for business? Should I study? Well, it depends. Do I want to pass? That's a hypothetical imperative. A categorical imperative isn't like that. So a categorical imperative is something that's in the category of things you should or should not do. So here's a categorical imperative. Murder is wrong. That is, it's imperative that you not kill innocent people, regardless of the consequences, regardless of any hypothetical condition, because killing innocent people is in the category of things that are wrong. It's categorically wrong. You see, in the second shopkeeper, says Kant, he has goodwill. He's morally praiseworthy because he's obeying not hypothetical imperatives, but categorical imperatives. That is, he thinks cheating your customers is in the category of things that are wrong. Okay, so now you have an idea of what the categorical imperative is. So now we need to get into the most important part of this lesson, which is something called the categorical imperative. All right. So now we're going to learn about the categorical imperative. This is one of the most important things you'll learn in this class. The categorical imperative is the essential idea in Kantian moral philosophy. So it's his attempt to formulate the fundamental moral rule on which all the other moral rules rely. So the categorical imperative is to Kantian duty ethics as the principle of utility is to consequentialist ethics. Kant, really, if you read him carefully, he really says there's really just one categorical imperative, but he provides, depending on how you read it, 3 or 4 different formulations of the categorical imperative. We'll focus on the 2 that are covered in the textbook. The first formulation is something called the principle of universalizability, and the second is something called the principle of humanity. So first, we'll look at the principle of universalizability. All right, so here's version 1 of the categorical imperative, the principle of universalizability. Kant says that we should act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction. That's just as clear as crystal. I guess we can just read that and move on. I'm kidding. I'll explain it. Kant has this wonderful way of writing sentences that consist entirely of words that you know, and you get to the end of the sentence and you still have no idea what he's talking about. But we'll unpack it a little bit. Okay, so let's see, words that we might need to mention here. Okay, so a maxim is a moral rule. But it's not just a rule. It's a rule consisting of what you should do and why you should do it. So it's consisting of the act plus the motive. And so if you're thinking about the 2 shopkeepers, the maxim of their actions were different. The first both shopkeepers both acted the same way, but had different motives. And so the maxim of the first shopkeeper's action was hypothetical. If it's bad for business, don't cheat your customers. The maxim of the second keeper's action was categorical. That is, don't cheat your customers no matter what. Okay, and so the maxim of your action is just a moral rule consisting of what you're doing and why you're doing it. All right? And a universal law is what our textbook calls a moral absolute. That is, it's a moral rule that applies to all people at all times without exception. And so the idea here is that you should act according to rules and with motives that could be universalized. That is, this is an oversimplification, but roughly, for Kant, the test of whether or not you are behaving morally is whether or not it would be rational for you to, and consistent, for you to will everybody to follow the same rules as you. This will be easier to see if we look at some examples. Russ Schaefer Landau, our textbook author, gives a helpful example of a traffic jam. So you've probably had this experience. You're stuck in a traffic jam, and you find somebody who, and you see somebody who pulls out of the line of cars and drives on the shoulder in the emergency lane and passes everybody and then squeezes his way back in further down the road. And how do you feel about the person who does that? Or, you know, you're waiting in line for the roller coaster at the amusement park, and then you see somebody cutting the line. How do you feel about the person who does that? Well, if you're like most people, you find their behavior morally objectionable. You think that reveals a defect in their moral character. You think what they're doing is wrong. And why is it wrong? Well, it's not fair. That is, the person who does that he's not following the same rules as everybody else. By his behavior, he's made an exception of himself. It's as though he's saying that where he has to be is more important than where we have to be. That his time is more important than ours. That he's somehow special. That he's above the law. That he's exempt from the rules. And most of us find that to be an injustice, to be unfair. And the principle of universalizability is really, it's a principle of fairness and a principle of justice. It's saying that you should follow the same rules as everybody else. And so what Kant wants to say to the person who cuts the line is, what if everybody did that? What if we universalized your behavior? What if everybody acted the way you act? And well, what if? Well, if everybody drove in the emergency lane when there was traffic, then there would just be a traffic jam in the emergency lane. That is, the only way that driving the emergency lane would even work is if most people don't do that. That is, it's not just that you're driving the emergency lane, it's you're driving in the emergency lane while simultaneously requiring everybody else not to. Same thing with cutting the line on the roller coaster. What if everybody just cut to the front? Well, there wouldn't be a line to cut. There would just be a stampede, you see. And so the reason we find it so objectionable is because of the fundamental unfairness of it, that the person's making an exception of himself. He's not following the same rules as everybody else. That's the idea of the principle of universalizability. I read a book once. I hesitate to mention this in mixed company, but this is supposed to be a college course by a philosopher named Aaron James. The title of the book was called Assholes, a Theory. And it was a philosopher, kind of a Kantian philosopher. It was a philosophical examination of the concept of an asshole. And here's the definition that Aaron James gave. Hold on, let me read this so I get it right. Pardon my French. An asshole is somebody who allows themselves to enjoy special advantages in social relations out of an entrenched sense of entitlement. That isn't, an asshole is somebody who thinks he's better than everybody else, that he's above the law, that the rules that apply to everybody else don't apply to him. That is, it's somebody who thinks he's special, or somebody who violates the categorical imperative. And so this is the first version of the categorical imperative. Kant's favorite example is an example of lying. So if you're going to lie, what's the maximum of your action? Well, the act is that I'm going to say something that's not true, and the motive is that I want to deceive somebody. That is, the point of a lie is to have it be believed. But in order for your lie to be believed, you need to live in a world where people trust each other. That is, in a world where your lying behavior is universalized, everybody would be lying to everybody all the time. There wouldn't be any presupposition of telling the truth. And then the intent of your lie would be undermined. You see the point? That is, lying presupposes a world where people tell the truth in the same way that cutting the line presupposes a world where people wait in line. And so lying behavior can't be universalized. It's unfair. So that's the principle of universalizability. Oh, I have a couple more. I have one more example of this. This is from a 2015 encyclical from Pope Francis about the environment. And he was trying to talk about environmental ethics and our responsibility to the planet. And being, a Catholic, he didn't want to say what so many people say, which is that human beings are a plague on the planet, and the way to solve our environmental problems is to reduce the population. If you're a Catholic, you can't say that. And so instead he wanted to say that the problem is our consumerism. The problem isn't the babies, it's the overconsumption of a relatively few wealthy people. And so he talks about something that he calls the present model of distribution, whereby a minority, a small group, believes that it has the right to consume in a way that can never be universalized, since the planet cannot contain the waste products of such consumption. Now, whether you agree with the Pope or not, the thing to notice here is that his argument's Kantian. That is, he's saying the problem with the very wealthy people consuming much more than their fair share is that their behavior cannot be universalized. It's not fair. So this is the principle of universalizability. Fairness and justice and morality demand that you follow the same rules as everybody else, that you not make an exception of yourself, or maybe this way of putting it will speak to you, that you not be a hypocrite. Some philosophers say that the categorical imperative isn't really that great an idea. It's just the golden rule. Right? The golden rule says what? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Kant rejects the golden rule, and let me see if I can explain to you why. There's a loophole in the golden rule. It's sometimes very clever. So often when you're trying, the golden rule, incidentally, if you follow the golden rule, if you understand the golden rule, it's as good as anything I can teach you in this class. That you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you, because it is a principle of fairness, it's a principle of rational consistency, and there's a fundamental empathy here. It's a recognition of the fundamental similarity between yourself and others. And so the golden rule is a great moral principle, but Kant, being the clever philosopher he is, notices that there's a loophole in the golden rule. And if you try to, and we use the golden rule to try to, as part of our children's moral education. And sometimes clever children will notice the loophole in the golden rule. So like little Johnny hits little Billy on the playground, and then we say to little Johnny, how would you feel if little Billy did that to you? And maybe little Johnny says, oh, I wish he would try. Bring it on. You see, there's a loophole, like, that is, or put it to a different way. So the golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but suppose you're a masochist who enjoys pain. So if you would do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and you enjoy pain, well, that implies that you should hurt others. That is, if you're a masochist, you should be a sadist too. And so you see, there is this loophole in the golden rule. It's kind of contingent on how you would want people to treat you. If you want to be mistreated, then it would seem to give you license to mistreat others. That is, the golden rule is a hypothetical imperative. If you would not want others to hurt you, then you should not hurt others. But suppose you don't care if others hurt you. You see the trouble. And so this is an oversimplification, but it might really help some of you. One way of understanding the principle of universalizability is it's Kant's attempt to formulate something like the golden rule without the loophole. That is, so instead of saying do unto others as you would have them do unto you, Kant's saying act in a way that you would have everybody act towards everybody else at all times. that is, act in a way that could be universalized. So hopefully that helps somebody. Okay, so that's the principle of universalizability. Now let's look at the second version of the categorical imperative. I got new markers. They're very nice, but they don't erase as well as the old markers. One of these days, my dear friends in the studio here are going to help me edit these videos so you don't have to sit there and watch me erase for so long. Okay, the categorical imperative. We've been through what a categorical imperative is. We've been through the principle of universalizability. Here's the second formulation of the categorical imperative. This is called the principle of humanity. So if the principle of universalizability is about justice and fairness, the principle of humanity is about autonomy and respect. If the principle of universalizability is about our moral obligations, the principle of humanity is about our rights. And here's what the principle of humanity says. It says that you should act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. Okay, the principle of humanity says to act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. So remember back to the first part of this lesson that humanity for Kant means rational and autonomous moral agents. And an end is, you might know the Greek word telos, but it's like a purpose or a goal. But the idea here is for Kant, humans are ends in themselves. That is, humans are the ultimate purpose of morality. They're the ultimate end towards which morality aims. Or simply put, people have rights. And they have rights because of their rationality and autonomy. And so, okay, you should never treat somebody as a mere means. You should always treat them at the same time as an end. So you maybe have heard the expression, it was a means to an end. And what does that mean? It means it was a way of accomplishing a goal. And so the means was the way, and the end was the goal. And so you lied to your teacher. in order to get an extension on an assignment. It was a means to an end. That is, the lie was the way, and the extension was the goal. The lie was the means, the end was the extension. Or famously, Harry Truman makes the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Horrible thing to drop weapons of mass destruction on civilian populations. Many innocent people were killed, but it was a means to an end. It brought about an end to World War II and probably saved lives in the long run. That is, the killing of the innocent was the means, and the bringing about an end to the war was the end. So that's what a means to an end is. And what Kant says is it's always wrong to use a human being as a mere means, because you always have to treat the human being himself as though he were the end, as though he himself were the goal. And so you remember when we first started this lesson a few weeks ago, we did something called the trolley car problem. And most of us said that we did not want to push the fat guy off the bridge to stop the speeding trolley car, even if doing so would save the lives of the people tied to the track. And Kant could explain very well why that is, because pushing the fat guy off the bridge to save the people tied to the track is using him as a mere means. That is, you're treating him as less than human. You're using him as like trolley car brakes. And the problem is he's not trolley car brakes, he's a human being with rights, you see. Okay, so this is the idea. Humanity is ends in themselves. And so, okay, what is it to treat somebody as an end in himself? To treat a person as an end in themselves is to treat them as though they were rational and autonomous. To treat them as though they had a mind and a will of their own. There's a very deep moral insight here. This is to me one of the more profound things we're going to learn in this course. And so I'm going to give you a few, at first I'm going to ask a few rhetorical questions that might seem sort of absurd or preposterous, but hopefully it'll help you see the point. So suppose I ask you a question like this. What's so bad about rape? Well, it's not consensual, right? But what's the moral difference between consensual sex and rape? Why is consensual sex permitted and rape is not? Why does consent make such a difference? And it's like, well, because if you have the consent of your sexual partner, then that means that they were in their right mind. That is, they were in possession of their rational faculties, and they chose to have sex with you of their own free will. And so if you have consent, you've treated your partner as an end in themselves, as though they had a mind and a will of their own. Whereas if you don't have consent, either the person you're having sex with lacked the rationality, so maybe they were too young to understand, or too drunk to understand. So young people and drunk people can't give consent because they don't have the mind, the mental capability. They're not in possession of their rational faculties. And I mean, like what? And so okay. So and then the autonomy just has to do with the willingness. And so, in order to get consent, somebody has to understand what they're doing and be willing to do it, and that makes the difference. So. Okay, so that's one example. Here's another example. What's so bad about slavery? I mean, most of us recognize slavery for the atrocity that it was, but why was it so atrocious? What was so bad about it? I mean, to really appreciate this, what's the difference between slavery and voluntary labor? Sometimes you'll hear sort of apologists for this. Used to be pretty common. You would hear people sort of who are apologists for the institution of slavery, especially in America, point out compare the condition of your average factory worker in a textile mill in the North with your average slave on a plantation in the South. And in some cases, you might find that actually the standard of living for your average slave in the South was much higher than the standard of living for your average textile worker in the North. They got better food, more exercise, they were more comfortable, possibly. Now, I don't know if that's really true or not, but Kant might ask, so what if it was? Because there's a crucial moral difference between voluntary labor and slavery. And it's that the voluntary labor is voluntary. That is, the factory worker in the North, however poorly he was treated, was there of his own free will and could quit and leave. The slave was not free to do so. And so the peculiar evil of slavery is that the slaves were treated as subhuman. And what did that mean to say that they were treated as subhuman? It's they were treated as though they didn't have a will of their own. They were being denied their freedom. And notice too, the same goes to the previous example about rape victims. That is, if you ever listen to a rape victim discuss what happened, she's traumatized, right? And the way she describes it is very telling. It's very Kantian, because typically the victim of a rape will say something like this: I felt used, I felt violated, I felt objectified, I felt like a piece of meat. You see, that is, she was being treated as a mere means. She was being treated as though she weren't human. She was just being used to fulfill somebody else's desire and not having her own desires and will respected. You see what I mean? And okay, so this is the lovely thing about the principle of humanity, and it explains very well the foundation of our rights and our deepest moral intuitions. Fat guys aren't trolley car brakes. It's wrong to have sex with people who aren't in their right mind and aren't willing. And slavery is an atrocity. And it's an atrocity because it involves treating people as less than human, using them as mere means, not treating them as ends in themselves. I have maybe one more example of this. I'm probably getting carried away, but back when I was studying this, there was a big debate about whether or not torture was ever morally justified. And there's a very interesting sort of a Kantian argument against torture. Because what's the goal of torturing somebody? Well, it's to break their will. And breaking somebody's will is a horrifying thing to do, because what you're doing when you break their will is you're taking away the thing that makes them human. And so that's it. That's the principle of humanity. People have rights because they're moral beings, and you should treat them as such. Okay, this is the categorical imperative. This is Kantian duty ethics. By now, you should kind of have a pretty good understanding of what Kant believes. That is, Kant believes that morality isn't about the consequences of our actions. At best, the kind of consequentialist reasoning you get in utilitarianism, it's just prudence. It's not morality. That morality is about laws. It's about rights and obligations. And we're obligated to act in a way that can be universalized. We're obligated to follow the same rules as everybody else, and people have rights. People should be treated as though they had a mind and a will of their own. That's the Kantian perspective. There's a lot to be said for it. It's consistent with our deepest moral intuitions about the moral worth of a human being, about justice, fairness, autonomy, respect. I think probably need to pause here. Probably I need a break, and maybe you do too. But I have one more lecture. Next one I'm going to go through, and we're going to do kind of a criticism of Kantian duty ethics. Thank you.